Imagine you live in the year 2100. You're married with kids and you live on Earth. You work at an office job on Mars. Every day, you enter a teleportation machine that instantly transports you to Mars. And when your work is done, the machine teleports you back. Convenient, right? Well, there is a slight catch. When the machine teleports you, it copies everything about you, your cells, atoms, thoughts, personality, and destroys it. The machine sends a copy of you to its corresponding machine on Mars and reconstructs you. This copy of you then goes back to work until it is time to go back to Earth. This process happens almost instantaneously, faster than the blink of an eye. With this in mind, would you say that this version of you is the same person who is just on Earth? If so, what makes you the same person on both Earth and Mars? If not, would you say that you died on Earth and that there is an exact replica of you on Mars? Derek Parfit, the philosopher who came up with this case, dubbed it the teletransportation case, and he has an alternate view to this question. He claims that it is not him who starts to exist on Mars, and that he died on Earth, but ultimately, it is irrelevant that he died, and a new copy of him exists on Mars. He claims that this scenario is just as good as ordinary survival due to his personal identity theory. He further claims that personal identity is not what matters, and instead, it is relation R that matters. In this video, I will present Parfit's personal identity theory and explore the implications of his theory on morality, assuming his personal identity theory to be true. I'm not saying that his theory is true. Rather, I'm assuming that it is true to ask what about morality, ethics, and laws would change. The case that I just presented is called the simple teletransportation case. This brings up two questions. First, are the versions of you on Earth and Mars the same person? The second question is what makes it the case that you either are or are not the same person in either case? There's been many personal identity theories that seek to answer these questions, such as memory theory, brain theory, body theory, and soul theory. All of these theories have different answers to these questions. For example, the memory theory may say that the two versions of you on Earth and Mars are the same person because both versions can recall certain memories that only you would have. However, a soul theorist may say that the soul cannot have two different bodies, making the two versions of you different people. Parfit's theory is a bit different than most of these theories. He calls it the reductionist view, and I will call it bundle theory. Most reductionist views claim that all you are your parts that make you who you are. Some rely on physical parts like atoms, molecules, cells, while others, like Parfit's, rely on psychological parts like brain states. Parfit calls these the physical criteria and the psychological criteria. Before I explain the psychological criteria, I'll first go over why Parfit believes you should be a reductionist. Think of the United States of America, for example. What is it made of? There are several answers to this question, including the federal government with three branches, the Constitution, its amendments, 50 states, etc. But then, if I were to ask you what makes these answers, you would probably say the president, federal agencies, Congress, the Supreme Court, lower federal courts, laws, policies, cities, counties, etc. If I were to ask you again what makes up these answers, you may say the people. What ultimately makes up the United States, along with every other nation in the world, are the people who live in it. Without the people, the United States would not exist. Parfit thinks that we should think in the same way when thinking about ourselves. When thinking about ourselves, you may point out that we cannot live without our heart and several of our organs, so we should accept the physical criteria. However, this is not entirely true, as I do not need my heart to live. I can accept a donor's heart, or even have an entirely artificial heart. And the same is true for many organs. Even our brain may soon be able to have certain parts swapped out with lab grown parts and neurochips. However, something we cannot replace is the psychological criterion, which I will explain now. The psychological criteria states that there is a psychological continuity necessary for a person to exist if and only if there is a certain chain of psychological connections over an extended period of time. This continuity has any kind of cause, and there are no branching continuities. There are two parts of this criteria, and these are psychological connectedness and psychological continuity. In order to consider myself the same person I was 10 years ago, I must establish both connectedness and continuity. An example of psychological connectedness would be that I recall having a sandwich to eat yesterday, and as I was eating that sandwich yesterday, I could recall having a soda the day before that. This would show that I am at the very least psychologically connected with myself from 2 days ago because I can recall certain experiences. Psychological continuity is just a strong chain of psychological connectedness over a period of time. So, if I follow this pattern of having the ability to remember what I ate the day before, continuing this trend for, say, 10 years, I could say that myself from 10 years ago and me now are the same person because we have psychological continuity, which is a strong chain of psychological connections. This does not have to be in periods of 10 years. It could be a month, 2 months, a year, 50 years, so on. Even though there may be a chain of strong psychological connections, this does not mean that your psychological continuity is strong. This is apparent over long periods of time. For example, if I was 60 years old and tried to remember something from when I was 20 years old, I may get some details wrong. Parfit tries to argue for something even more extreme. He also claims that since you are nothing more than a chain of strong psychological connections, then we're able to describe these strong chains in an impersonal way, meaning we can talk about ourselves and describe these chains without stating that you exist as a person. You might stop me at this point and ask, if I can't even acknowledge that I exist, and we are nothing more than a strong chain of some mental events, then does that not mean that personal identity may not even exist under this theory? Well, yes, you would be correct, as Parfit claims that personal identity is not what matters, and instead of personal identity being what matters, Parfit claims that relation R is what matters. Relation R is defined as psychological connectedness and or continuity with any cause. Going back to the Mars example, no matter what your answer was, whether you died or are the same person on Mars, it is irrelevant as you would still be are related to this person on Mars. Parfit describes this as just as good as ordinary survival because relation R matters and not personal identity. You technically would not be the same person that was born however many years ago. I would not be the same person who my mother gave birth to, and I would not be the same person in 10 years as I am now. Parfait even claims that we are not even the same person from one moment to the next because of our ever changing mental states. However, I am R related to the person who my mother gave birth to, and I'm going to be R related to the person I become in 10 years. Take the ship of Theseus thought experiment. In this thought experiment, Theseus and his crew have set sail, are in the middle of the ocean, and trying to reach a different city. During this journey, they have to slowly replace each part of their ship due to leakage. Eventually, every single part of their ship, down to the last wooden plank and bolt, are replaced. The question is the ship that Theseus makes landfall on the same one that he first set sail with? Some would say, yes, the ship is different because it has all new parts. Some would say no, since some of the newer parts were on the same ship as some of the older parts, making it the same ship. Parfit would say that it is not the same ship that set sail, but who cares if the ship slowly changes over time? The new ship has the exact same function as the old one, and is all related to its past version to the physical criterion rather than the psychological criterion. So, having a ship with brand new parts would be just as good as having the old one. We are similar to the ship of Theseus. As we age, our personality, feelings, beliefs, and even memories change over time. But if we are not the same person that we were even a few moments ago, then what exactly do we call ourselves? And the people that we are related to. Parfit calls this the series persons. And a series persons is just a group of people who are related. So, the person who my mother gave birth to, the version of myself from 10 years ago, and any future versions of me are all the same series person, as long as we maintain our R relation. You may worry that since you're not technically a person and that you never are the same person from one moment to the next, then we have no reason to care about our future selves and responsibility as a whole just gets thrown out the window. This is called the extreme claim. Perfect counters this with the moderate claim, which states that if bundle theory is true, then it is also true that there is less reason to care about your future series persons. However, you should still care for them as if they were a loved one. For example, if I were to constantly drink alcohol, do drugs, eat junk food, and overall live an unhealthy lifestyle, then my future series persons in 10 years or so would face severe consequences. My future series persons could face something like a large amount of medical debt because of my current neglect of being healthy. Someone who accepts the extreme claim would claim that my current version is not responsible for my future series person's medical debt because we are different people. However, Parfit argues that my current version is responsible for my future series person's condition, as quote, great imprudence is morally wrong. We ought not to do to our future series persons what it would be wrong to do to other people. End quote. Knowingly ignoring someone in need is morally wrong. And if I were to live an unhealthy lifestyle, then I would also know that my future series persons would face severe consequences because of my actions. Another worry of bundle theory is that it would seem that all moral responsibilities would cease to exist, and we would not be able to justify punishing someone who commits crimes. This is because the one who's being arrested for a crime will technically not be the one who committed the crime. Parfit argues that we could still hold people accountable for a crime they didn't technically commit, and it depends on how strong their psychological continuity is with the one who committed the crime. For example, say my past series persons robbed a bank about a year ago, and today I was arrested for it. Though I could claim that I am being wrongfully arrested and I didn't commit the crime, I have a strong psychological continuity of myself from a year ago. Perfect compares this to arresting a sane accomplice. Because of my strong psychological continuity, I would still be held accountable. However, instead of being arrested today, say my future series persons were to be arrested in 50 years. In this case, it would be much harder to justify holding my future series persons accountable for my past series person's actions, as my past version and my future version's psychological continuity would be much weaker. It may even be so weak that my future series persons gets many details of the robbery wrong. So the strength of the psychological continuity is ultimately what determines holding one accountable for a crime they commit under bundle theory. Straying away from Parfit, I will quickly argue that it is possible to hold someone morally responsible for a crime, even if they have little to no our relation with the person who committed the crime. I will have a timeline of 4 events, and these events will be in time 1, time 2, time 3, and time 4. At time 1, Chester decides to go and buy a drug. At time 2, Chester takes the drug. At time 3, Chester is incredibly high on this drug. This drug makes him forget everything about his life and makes him believe that he is a superhero and needs to kill a villain. He does just that, but the villain he kills is actually just a random civilian. At time 4, Chester wakes up from his drug induced hallucination and is arrested for killing the random civilian. In this case, Chester at time 3 has no R relation to Chester at time 1, time 2, or time 4. However, Chester at time 4 would be R related to Chester at time 1 and time 2 because he is no longer hallucinating. Parfit may argue that Chester at time 4 cannot be held responsible for Chester at time three's actions. However, Chester at time 1 and time two's actions indirectly cause someone's death. Chester at time 1 and time 2 knowingly bought and took a drug that would cause another person to kill someone. Because of this, Chester at time 4 is also responsible for the death of the civilian because of his our relation to time 1 and time 2, making him a sane accomplice. Once again, my goal is not to convince you that bundle theory is true and that we're all a bunch of random temporal beings that exist in units. Rather, I simply wanted to present bundle theory in order to see what changes this theory has on ethics. Hopefully, you were able to follow all of this jargon, and your headache after this video is not too bad. If nothing really made sense in this video, don't worry, as it took me several weeks to fully understand what Derek Parfit was trying to say. Thank you for watching.